Welcome to the Old Roads Podcast, a podcast that seeks to bring the wisdom of the past to the challenges of the present. I am your host, Aaron O'Kelly. I'm a pastor and a theological educator. For the last Monday of the month, we'll be doing a Q&A episode today, and I've taken two questions from a listener, and I'm going to call these questions 1A and 1B because they are related, and then I have another question I'll address today. But they all are in the same vicinity of questions regarding children, having children, bearing children, and fertility and so forth. Question 1A says, does the Bible commend us to have as many children as a woman's body can bear, or is there room for a wise and prayerful evaluation of our resources, health, and inclination in planning our family size? I have encountered teaching from sources like Bill Gothard, the Quiverful movement, and within conservative reform movements that say, at best, it's more spiritual to have more kids, or that it's selfish and sinful to plan your family size. And I think that's a great question, and I've been thinking that through as I've thought about how I was going to answer it. First, I would want to start off by saying, let's begin with the affirmation that the Bible is pro-children. Genesis 1:28, God commanded Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And then he told Noah after the flood, specifically Noah's sons and their wives, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth in Genesis 9:1 and verse 7. And there's a very strong pro-child stance throughout the Bible. Psalm 127, 3-5 is a famous passage that says, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. That's where the quiverful terminology comes from. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. The Bible speaks highly of children and of family. And this is a value that we as Christians should affirm. We live in an age when children are aborted, when children are regarded as burdens, when they're regarded as inconveniences, and even among many on the left, they are regarded as a threat to the well-being of the future of the planet. And there are all kinds of ways that we are given incentives not to have children or to limit fertility today. Even the transgender movement, I would argue, is having that effect on even children today who are being permanently maimed for life so that they will never be able to reproduce. And it's a tragic thing that we're witnessing today. So in the face of a culture that I would argue in many ways is anti-child, we as the church must be pro-children. And we must recognize that bearing children is one of the purposes of marriage, one of the very clearly revealed purposes both in Scripture and in nature itself. So I would begin this conversation by saying to married couples, number one, you have a responsibility to give yourself to your spouse regularly. 1 Corinthians 7, 1-5 makes that clear. That is to be a normal part of marriage. And since that is an act that leads to children, there ought to be an openness to the blessing of children in a marriage. If two people go into a marriage and they're not providentially hindered from having children, but they say that they never want to have children as a married couple, I would want to explore deeply their motivations for saying that. That raises red flags for me. I also believe, third, we should have no stigma for the idea of a large family. I know you sometimes see large families today, and in our culture, large families are often seen as strange, and they're stigmatized for being too large. And again, I think there's some of that environmental movement coming into play here where people think if you have that many children, then you're producing people who are going to consume scarce resources and you're going to lead to future problems for humanity and pollute the planet and contribute to climate change and all this. And I think that's just simply not true. I think it's been demonstrably proven that birth rates are too low, that we are looking at economic difficulties in the future as a result of low birth rates, that the greatest resource we have for the future of our planet is actually human beings, and that it is a lie from Satan that tells us that having a large family is destructive. We should not stigmatize large families, but we should see them as a blessing. And then fourth, I would say to married couples, recognize your own limitations when it comes to controlling family size. There are certain things we can do, and I'll talk about whether or not we should here in a minute, but there are things we can do to limit family size. And I just want to make it clear that even though we have these abilities, we are still limited. We are not God, and we ultimately don't get to decide on these questions. And so beginning with those four considerations, I do want to say that there is no command in Scripture about having a particular number of children. The Bible is very pro-child, and it says that having children is a purpose of marriage, and thus if you're not providentially hindered from having children, I believe you should be open to that. But it's also true that a woman could bear in her life somewhere around 15 to 20 kids. That would be a very, very large family. I've actually never known a family that large. I think the largest family I can think of would be the Duggar family that had their own show, and even they only had about 13, if I remember correctly. So 15 to 20, of which a woman is capable of bearing in her lifetime, that seems to be an extreme. And so I do not see any obligation for us to have as many as we possibly can. The Bible never tells us that we must bear as many children as we possibly can. And I would say that as a matter of stewardship, because the Bible doesn't give us any rule here, it doesn't give us any clear direction about saying this many versus that many or this consideration versus that one. As a matter of stewardship, couples are not forbidden from using their judgment, coming to their own conclusions about their own family, their own situation, and using their own judgment to control family size to a certain degree. So I would argue as long as the methods of controlling that are ethical, which means they're not abortifacient, they don't cause abortions of living embryos, then I would say those methods are ethically permissible as long as they're pursued with a motivation that is seeking to glorify God and not seeking to say that children are simply a burden to be avoided. I stand corrected. My producer, Jeremy, just showed me that the Duggars actually had 19 children. Now I remember correctly. Yeah, it was 19 children. But they're the only family I've ever known who had that many. And certainly it's not an obligation that we try to have that many. So in family planning, I think the key question to ask is this: what is my motive? What is it that we as a married couple are deciding, and why? Is this something that I can do in faith to please God? The Bible tells us, Romans 14, verse 23, whatever is not from faith is sin. So if you can't do it in faith, then don't do it. But if you can, if you recognize this is an opportunity the Lord has given me to exercise some judgment and wisdom in my own life choices, determining the size of my family and perhaps even how far apart children might be in my family, then I would say you are free to do that. And Christians will land in different places here. Some will say we don't have the freedom of conscience to limit our family size, and then others will. So I would say that's just a matter that we ought to leave to the individual conscience of a believer, because we do not have clear directions from God that says we must impose a law. And thus I would say let's allow for freedom here as long as we maintain a general openness to this blessing of children. A related question to that, question 1b, is how would you counsel a family whose husband believes they must not prevent pregnancies, but whose wife is exhausted from birthing and raising a lot of children and has asked for a reprieve? Now, it's interesting, this question could actually run in the opposite direction. It could be a wife who has the conscience issue, but the husband who's concerned for the financial situation, perhaps, or just the general demands of having such a large family. But it could run in either direction. It could be husband who wants the big family, wife who wants to stop, wife who wants the big family, husband wants to stop. It would really depend on the specifics here regarding how I would give counsel. Generally speaking, I would want spouses to have the same convictions on this. That is, they would either both say we are not going to try to prevent pregnancy, or they would both say we are willing to use these methods to try to prevent pregnancy. I would want them to have the same convictions because they are morally obligated to give themselves to each other. Again, 1 Corinthians 7, 1-5. And so in doing that, they need to be on the same page about how they are to engage in that. So if they're on different pages convictionally about this, then I'd want to explore deeper how each one of them is approaching this particular issue in relation to the other spouse. So, for example, is the husband loving his wife as Christ loved the church? And so let's walk that through with this particular husband and this particular wife. Is he considering sufficiently her health and well-being? There are some situations where a wife has been told by a doctor, for you to get pregnant again is to put your own health at great risk. And so in that situation, I would definitely want to have a serious conversation with the husband to say, have you considered sufficiently what your doctor or what your wife's doctor has told her about the risks here? Barring that kind of a serious issue, I would want to ask what other health considerations might be involved, both physical health and simply the emotional well-being of the wife in this situation. Is the husband loving her well and considering what she is bringing to this conversation? By the same token, is the wife respecting her husband and considering sufficiently the matter of his conscience? And hopefully through a conversation about these issues, we could get down to the heart of the issue and hopefully reach an agreement between a husband and wife who simply had differing convictions there. But that's how I would have to approach it. There would be so many specifics involved that I don't think I can give a one-size-fits-all answer for every situation there. A second question I want to raise today, I say that I want to raise it because it actually wasn't submitted to me by a listener, but I'm going to slip it in anyway because it has been in the headlines recently. So here's a question that someone might one day ask me, and I'll go ahead and answer it now. What do you think of in vitro fertilization, or IVF? This has been in the headlines recently because the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution entitled On the Ethical Realities of Reproductive Technologies and the Dignity of the Human Embryo that made some important ethical points about IVF technology. IVF is where the material, the sperm from the husband and the egg from the wife are taken and then fertilized outside of the wife's body and then are implanted in her body in the hopes of producing a pregnancy. And this is a technique that's used to help address infertility, and children have been born this way, and certainly any child who's born through IVF is a gift from the Lord and is to be welcomed and received and affirmed and celebrated. And thus, nothing I say here is in any way meant to call that into question. But we do have to reflect on the ethical reality of what is often happening in the actual procedures of IVF. And this is what the Southern Baptist Convention, acting through its messengers back in June, addressed. Now, I won't read the whole resolution, but I'll read sections of it that get to the heart of what is being said. Among other things, the Southern Baptist Convention said, whereas every human being is made in God's image and thus to be respected and protected from the moment of fertilization until natural death, without regard to developmental stage or location, whereas the in vitro fertilization process routinely generates more embryos than can be safely implanted, thus resulting in the continued freezing, stockpiling, and ultimate destruction of human embryos, some of whom may also be subjected to medical experimentation, and whereas in vitro fertilization most often participates in the destruction of embryonic human life and increasingly engages in dehumanizing methods for determining suitability for life and genetic sorting based on notions of genetic fitness and parental preferences, and whereas estimates suggest that between 1 million and 1.5 million human beings are currently stored in cryogenic freezers in an embryonic state throughout the United States, with most unquestionably destined for eventual destruction, now therefore be it resolved that the messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in Indianapolis, Indiana, June 11th and 12th, 2024, call on Southern Baptists to reaffirm the unconditional value and right to life of every human being, including those in an embryonic stage, and to only utilize reproductive technologies consistent with that affirmation, especially in the number of embryos generated in the IVF process. What does all that mean? It means that where IVF creates human beings who are not inserted into their mother's womb, or not intended to be attempted for a pregnancy, I'll put it that way, but rather are put in storage, that we are mistreating these human beings. If we truly are pro-life, if we truly believe that life begins at the moment of conception, then the idea of creating human beings so that we can put them in a freezer as backups is ethically outrageous. And that is what IVF often leads to. IVF most often creates surplus embryos because the chances of actually having a successful pregnancy still remain fairly low, even with IVF. And thus, there are often created more embryos than are needed. And they are created with the intention that they'll be stored and used as backups if you have to use them in the future. And so that is what the Southern Baptist Convention was speaking about, and that's what they were raising ethical protests against. Now, unfortunately, the Republican Party has gone full throttle on supporting IVF. This is a departure now from its previous pro-life commitments. So here the Southern Baptist Convention now stands against the Republican Party on this particular issue, and I hope that over time the Republican Party will come back to truly pro-life roots. But for the time being, we find ourselves ethically removed somewhat from the Republican Party on this particular issue. Very far removed from the Democrat Party, which is not only in favor of this, but in any number of ways of destroying human embryos and human beings in the womb well beyond this stage. But here we're beginning to see a rift between Southern Baptists and the Republican Party. And IVF is an important issue for us to consider. Is it possible to produce only the number of embryos that you intend to try to implant through IVF? Yes, I think that is possible. I think that sometimes happens. And if that is the way it is practiced, then the same moral objections do not apply. But it is worth noting that when it is done that way, my understanding is that the chances of true pregnancy actually go even much lower. Being an expensive medical practice, it may not be as helpful a practice for fertility if these ethical restrictions are observed. So there are numerous ethical questions around IVF that need to be very carefully considered so that we do not, as Christians, go into this practice without considering whether or not we are creating human beings who are going to be left in a freezer and eventually destroyed for research purposes. As a society, the ethical ramifications of simply continuing that practice seem to be profound, and we should not casually disregard human life in that way. Well, thank you to all who have listened and submitted questions, and I do hope you will continue to send in questions, and you can send those to the oldroadspodcast@gmail.com. If you benefited from this podcast, would you consider subscribing, leave us a 5-star review, or share it with a friend? And if you'd like to support this ministry financially, you can sign up as a patron at theoldroadspodcast.com. Until next time, remember Jeremiah 6:16, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look, and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls."